are getting ahead of ourselves and we are thinking about potential sanctions as a result of any of these trials, let alone, I mean, there's these things getting to trial. There's the question of conviction. There's the question of sentencing. But then there is, at the end of that road, the prospect of the prohibitive favorite for the Republican presidential nomination being in prison.
Yeah.
Do we as a country have an interest in him not going to prison so that we can still call ourselves a country where leading politicians don't get locked up?
Look, I think that's going to be a much debated issue throughout the country over the next months, because holding him accountable can happen in a number of ways. Prison obviously is one of them, but there are other approaches that can be taken. I think one of the important comments that came out of this long day down in Georgia was by the former lieutenant governor when he said, this is a pivot point. The Republican Party needs to move away. Quit being part of a cult, in effect, is what he meant, where you follow someone who lies to you, undermines legitimate processes of government. Move away from him politically. And, you know, trying to get back to politics in the sense that we used to think we had it, despite all the human frailties that accompanied it, where, you had parties that would sanction and hold accountable their own members. I was on the impeachment inquiry staff. You cannot make up my life, And so back in 1974, when the impeachment by the House Judiciary Committee was voted on, 4 Republicans voted to impeach President Nixon. Then 3 members of the Senate, leading Republican senators, I think it was Barry Goldwater and Howard Baker and I think Hugh Scott, went to see President Nixon and said, this was a bipartisan vote, you need to resign. Well, that's almost impossible to imagine today because of what's happened to the Republican Party, what they've allowed to happen to themselves. So I hope that we won't have accountability just for Donald Trump, and if there are others named in these indictments along with him for their behavior, but we'll also have accountability for a political party that has just thrown in with all of the lies and the divisiveness and the lack of any conscience about what was being done to the country.
In terms of getting out of this and coming out of this crisis stronger, hopefully, for having confronted, I think, very dark prospects in terms of what this means for democracy. It does feel like the Republican Party as a whole is not ready to make that turn. And I'm thinking really about Ron DeSantis as the guy who's running second to Donald Trump in the Republican primary right now. He is promising that there shouldn't be an independent Department of Justice.
Yeah, well, he's promising anything to try to get some attention. It's kind of pathetic, isn't it?
He's also removed 2 elected prosecutors in Florida who were chosen, who were elected, who he stepped in and removed them. Georgia Republicans have given themselves the power to remove elected prosecutors as well, just ahead of Fani Willis making this decision. That law will go into effect about 7 or 8 weeks from now, which will give them that opportunity. It does feel like the idea of law enforcement being used as a tool of partisan politics is something that, with whatever justification, the Republican Party is really embracing and ready to run with or without Trump. That feels like a big step in the wrong direction.
That's yet to be determined, Rachel. That is yet to be determined. I think it is possible that there are many now in the Republican Party who have signed on to that kind of approach to politics, that undermining of democracy, undermining the rule of law. But the shadow of Trump looms so large over all of them. It's really hard to know, once he's off the scene, one way or the other, politically or because of accountability arising out of the various indictments he faces, whether or not backbone will all of a sudden be regrown, whether conscience will once again be part of the, the Republican Party ethos. We don't know. We hope, because it would be for the good of the country that were to happen. But if it doesn't, the only way we can possibly contest it and defeat it is through the rule of law, as we're seeing with these prosecutors at the federal and now the state level, but also through elections, where we have to defeat those who want to weaponize divisiveness, who want to undermine democratic values and institutions. And that should be, frankly, nonpartisan, not just bipartisan. People should all be saying what the so-called never-Trumpers, the former Republicans who are, now out beating the drums to say you cannot support him and you cannot support the people who support his attitude toward our country.
On the issue of sort of healing and getting better as a country on this, in reading your article in The Atlantic, I feel like I get the diagnosis. And you talk about Surgeon General Vivek Murthy having essentially diagnosed this problem of loneliness being a health problem in this country. You describe it as a real political problem as well. And I get, in a very fundamental way, this idea that, atomized, disconnected populations are really primed for extremism. That's part of what makes us vulnerable to the call of strongman leadership and authoritarianism, makes us susceptible to it like any other number of mature democracies around the world. What I don't get is the prescription for how to fix that, and whether that is a prescription that should come from people who want to be political leaders, or whether that's something we need to cure as a culture in some other way. I mean, what's the way out of it?
Well, I think it's cultural, political, and probably economic as well. I think we have to do a much better job of finding ways for people to work together again, work together on community projects, work together through existing organizations, whether it be, civic or religious. I mean, look at the outpouring of help for the people in Maui right now. I mean, that kind of volunteer effort that is so American, so much at the core of who we are when we are at our best. But I also think that we have to do a better job of trying to stand up against the divisiveness and against the constant stream of lies and falsehoods that come out of not just politicians, but also social media and other sources of information. So there's enough work for all of us to do. It's not just political leaders. It's really everybody saying, this country is too precious, too valuable, too important to allow it to continue to be fragmented the way it has been. And rebuilding that sense of trust and community is no easy task. I don't think anybody would argue with how difficult it would be. But there are ways of doing it. And let me just say, I don't think Joe Biden gets credit enough for trying to model responsible leadership. Just kind of getting up every day, doing the job. The legislative accomplishments that came out of his first, year and a half were amazing. We're rebuilding our infrastructure. We're once again investing in clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and so much more. We're trying to, from a legislative perspective, under his leadership, to put back into place some of the things that give people a sense, perhaps, of security and confidence, optimism about the future. And, what more can a leader do? I mean, really, when you come down and think about it, we've got Democratic governors now who are making school lunch free. That's a big deal because, unfortunately, we have a lot of kids who don't get adequate nutrition. And we have Republican governors who are lowering the age of employment so that 13 and 14-year-olds can now be put to work. That is, in a nutshell, kind of where we are. Why wouldn't we want to join hands and support families in a difficult time, and particularly try to give kids more stability to be able to have better choices instead of just ripping away every social support? So this has to happen at all levels of politics, government, but more broadly, society as well.